Okay, this is the story for fourth grade for this week that starts us out. We're going to be working on appreciative listening, which means I want you guys to be listening for important details in the story. This is one that has a lot of emotion tied to it, so kind of be prepared for that. There's some funny things, there's some sad things, but I want you to be listening for those details. What made you smile? More specifically, why did they start the story the way that they did, okay? So this is called Ricky and Henry, A True Story by Jane Goodall. Ricky was born in the rainforest of Central Africa. For the first 2 years, she lived with her mother and the other chimpanzees of the community. Her mother was the center of Ricky's world. She carried her from place to place. She comforted her when she was hurting or frightened. Every hour or so, more often if she wanted, Ricky could drink the good warm milk from her mother's breast. Perhaps she had an older brother or sister. Perhaps her grandmother was alive. We shall never know. Because one day, probably at first light when the chimpanzees were starting to leave their night nests and feed, a loud bang disturbed the peace of the forest. Ricky's mother fell to the ground, dead or mortally wounded. Screaming in terror, Ricky clung to her mother tightly, who'd never before let her down. But she could not help Ricky now. She'd never help her again. The hunter seized Ricky and pushed her into a tiny basket while the infant chimpanzee, who didn't understand, went on screaming and screaming for her mother. The long journey through the forest, cramped in a little basket, must have been a nightmare for Ricky. She was hungry, but there was no warm, comforting milk. She was frightened, and she was hurting because shotgun pellets were lodged in her little body. But however much she cried, there was no one to help. Eventually, Ricky was tipped roughly out of the basket. She stared around in bewilderment. Everywhere there were huge people crowding close and staring at her, laughing in loud voices. Ricky was being offered for sale in one of the markets of Brazzaville in the Congo Republic. It was hot, and she was tired and thirsty. Her wounds were hurting even more. Desperately, she looked around for her mother, crying softly, but her mother did not come, and none of the people understood. Ricky stopped crying and curled up on the ground. She closed her eyes. The tall, distinguished Congolese man, who stopped presently to look at her, thought that maybe the little chimpanzee infant was dead. He bent down and touched her. She opened her eyes. She was too tired and weak to be frightened. The tall man knew it was against the law to capture and sell infant chimpanzees. He was angry and threatened the hunter, saying that he would report him to the officials. The hunter, who probably didn't even know the law of the land, was scared and ran off, leaving Ricky behind. So the tall man picked up Ricky, who was stiff with terror. He wrapped his jacket around her and carried her back to his house. As he went up the steps, his shaggy dog Henry sniffed the strange-smelling creature in his master's jacket. He growled a little, then curled up and went back to sleep. The tall man was very kind to Ricky. He found out the right food for an infant chimpanzee and fed her good meals. He asked a doctor to take the shotgun pellets from her neck and back. And gradually some of the joy in her life returned. Of course, she must have often thought about her mother and her life in the forest, but she learned to make the best of her new way of living, part of a human family. The tall man was her guardian, and Ricky loved him best. She was terribly upset when he had to go away on a business trip. The rest of his family did not like her in the house. They went on feeding her, but they shut her outside. Good food is certainly necessary for an infant chimpanzee, but just like a human child, Ricky needed affectionate contact with a caring adult. She needed love. In her desperation, she turned to the only adult she could find, Henry, the dog. She went over to him and he sat watching her and reached out to hold his fur. At first he was scared. Each time she reached out, he growled a little and moved away, but eventually he let her hold on to him. When he lay to sleep, she lay beside him, still holding on to his fur. What a lovely picture they made. A small black chimpanzee with huge sad eyes clinging tightly to a medium-sized brown shaggy dog, whose bright eyes peered into the world through his thick fringe of curly hair. When Henry went around the streets of Brazzaville scrounging food from the dustbins, as all real dogs will do if they have an opportunity, Ricky went with him. She rode on his back, clinging on tight with arms and legs, just as if she was riding on her mother. At night she snuggled close beside him, holding his fur even when she was asleep. For several weeks, Ricky and Henry could be seen together in the streets or in the back garden of the big house where they lived. And then the tall man came back. Ricky was pleased to see him and hugged and kissed him for a long time, but she still spent lots of time riding around on Henry and sleeping close beside him when her human guardian was at work. At last the time came when Ricky was too big and too heavy for Henry. It was important for her to live with others of her kind so that she could learn chimpanzee behavior, chimpanzee manners. And so, though sad to part with her, her guardian sent her to a sanctuary where many orphans like herself were cared for. Soon Ricky had many new friends. And what about Henry? Wasn't he sad losing his chimpanzee friend? He was, of course, but not for long. The tall man felt sorry for his little brown dog, and so he found a new friend, another dog, dark and about the same size as Henry. So everyone was happy in the end. Postscript. This is something that comes at the end of a story, like something they need to add in, something that might have happened in an event after the fact. It was in 1993 that Ricky arrived at the Jane Goodall Institute's Chipunga Sanctuary near Point Nor in the Congo Republic. It's our biggest sanctuary, and there were 115 orphans when I visited in July 2003. Ricky is a healthy adolescent today. The country around the sanctuary is a beautiful mixture of forest and savanna, stretching down to the unspoiled shore of the Atlantic Ocean. Quite a few wild chimpanzees are still living there, and we're working with the government to protect the whole area. If only we could set our orphans free there, but sadly this is not possible. There are too many villages. Our chimpanzees would approach people and either be hurt or hurt someone. Moreover, wild chimpanzees protect their territory fiercely from strangers and would probably kill our orphans. We're trying to find a forest far from people and wild chimpanzees, but this is not easy. There are not many places like that, certainly not one suitable for chimpanzees to live. If you'd like to learn more about Chipunga and our other sanctuaries in Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa, and about the work of the Jane Goodall Institute, check out our website at www.janegoodall.org. You can also learn how you could help us care for Ricky. Once she needed Henry, now she needs you. So do all the other orphans like her. Lots of love, Jane Goodall. So if you're looking for something else to do during the week, it might be really interesting to visit that website or see what else you could learn about Jane Goodall. She's a pretty interesting person who's done a lot of conservation work with the chimpanzees and great apes. Thanks, guys.